People love to cheer on the underdog. Think of movies like Rocky, Rudy, and Will Smith's Pursuit of Happiness, or great legends like David and Goliath. Speaking of another legend, Robin Hood, our opponents always tell us that the reason we need big government is to take from the rich to give to the poor. But big government always seems to send money in the opposite direction. The latest Bombardier bailout would take $1 billion middle-class tax dollars and give it to a company of billionaire owners and millionaire executives. Ontario's Green Energy Act forces low-income families to buy overpriced electricity from millionaire insiders. And government-mandated cartels in the taxi sector empower millionaire taxi plate owners to rip off cab drivers and their passengers. It's the insider economy. Those who can afford to lobby the government and game the rules of government always win with bigger government. The underdogs, well, they're left to fight their own battles. And we need to fight along their side. That means fighting for immigrants who are qualified as engineers or doctors, but forced into minimum wage jobs because bureaucracy blocks them from their professions. It means financial transparency, so an Aboriginal woman can hold her leaders accountable for how they spend her money. It means further lowering taxes for the poor so that work always pays more than welfare. And speaking of welfare, we should get tough on welfare for the incompetent millionaire CEO who's coming back to the government for yet another bailout and another handout from working-class taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I believe that it is time that we shut down the insider economy and open up the free market economy, which is the greatest poverty-fighting machine ever invented. And in so doing, let us all become champions of Canada's underdogs. That is the basis upon which I approach any budget question. It has been proven time and time again that bigger and more bureaucratic government makes for poorer and less prosperous citizens. There are exceptions, of course. People with connections, people with well-paid lobbyists, they always do better. And we can expect that with recent Liberal announcements of new climate change, so-called climate change initiatives, we will see certain insiders who call themselves green energy entrepreneurs and consultants, they will make millions of dollars. They have made millions of dollars on the backs of working-class Ontarians ever since the passage of the so-called Green Energy Act, and they will make hundreds of millions of dollars more with the Ontario government's recent announcement, backed by this Prime Minister, that it will impose new taxes and regulations on Ontario families to pay for the enormous costs of the province's so-called climate change agenda. The recent budget set aside hundreds of millions of new dollars in new subsidies for these same insiders. And it is incumbent upon all of us to see who ends up getting the money. The question of social justice should weigh heavy on every single policy decision a government makes. And there are two questions we should ask, therefore, regarding social justice of every policy a government implements. And those questions are these: from whom? To whom? Any expenditure of money takes money from somebody and gives it to somebody else. This government has made a great rhetorical priority for the question of redistributing wealth And I believe that they will redistribute a lot of wealth. But I believe also on close examination, that redistribution will take money from the people who need it most and give it to the well-connected millionaire insiders that are most linked to the current government and its decision makers. And so over the next 3.5 years, my goal, and I hope the goal of the entire opposition, will be to stand up for those underdogs who actually earn their own money. And instead of those who are privileged and powerful and use that privilege and power to feast off the labors of other people. I think that you will see, Mr. Speaker, that the real champions of social justice are those who expound the free enterprise economy. Over the last 10 years, while the Conservative government was in power, people in the lowest 10% of income earners saw their incomes rise by 14%. That's after tax and after inflation. Middle-class Canadians saw their incomes rise by 10% after tax and after inflation. The share of wealth controlled by the top 1% actually declined in Canada, bucking trends to the contrary all around the world. So how is it then that the Liberal budget produced a graph that suggested that the middle class had not had a raise in 40 years? The information came from the finance department. I said it can't be true because we know that the last 10 years saw the middle class gain 10% after tax and inflation. So I said, how is it possible? So I went and looked at the data, and you know what? The Liberal budget was right. The after-tax incomes of people were just slightly higher in 2015 than they had been 40 years earlier after you account for inflation. How did that happen? The answer is that it actually took us 30 years to recover from the absolutely devastating economic policies of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So the current Prime Minister is right. After you account for the devastating decline in middle-class incomes that occurred in the 70s and early 80s under the National Energy Program and the big government centralized socialist approach to government, it actually took us 3 decades to recover the income growth of Canadians. 3 decades, and I'm proud to say that the greatest growth of all, according to the Finance Department data that was highlighted in the Liberal budget, occurred in the last 10 years when the previous Conservative Prime Minister was leading the government. So it is true that the middle class did not have an effective raise from 40 years back to the present. But we in the last 10 years have been correcting for that. What is most troubling is that the government doesn't learn from the graph that it put in its own budget because it is now repeating the very same policies that led to such devastating middle-class income declines. Expanding governments, out-of-control deficits, more and more regulations that hold people down and suffocate our entrepreneurs. Mr. Speaker, I ask that this government learn from history rather than repeating history. We know what works. We know what has failed. Let's look at the evidence and the facts and choose the right path, the path of the underdog, where Canadians get ahead based on their merit, not on their connections, where people who work hard, pay their taxes, and play by the rules can achieve great things for themselves, their families, and their communities, and where we shut down the insider economy and open up the free market economy as the greatest poverty-fighting machine the world has ever invented. Then and only then we can all say that we are champions of the underdog. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Gatineau.
Well, I want to thank the honourable member for that thunderclap from the failed school of supply-side economics. I I guess they were going to get to that in the fourth mandate, Mr. Speaker. Mon ami en face.
My friend from across the way has talked about insiders, as if he didn't have files to defend. So I'd like to talk about insiders, and I'd like to ask him a question on insiders. We defined insiders, we feel that it's important, for example, to defend those who have lost their jobs, the parents of families that want to get out of poverty, farmers who have lost the Canada Wheat Board under their government. These are people who weren't insiders in the previous Conservative government. So I'd like to know how my colleague, the member across the way, defines this idea of insiders. These parents, these people who are unemployed, these farmers, and the way that they were treated in our budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Carleton.
Thankful for the member raising the plight of working low-income people, for example. Those people have benefited by our previous government's decision to raise the personal exemption, which literally liberated hundreds of thousands of people from taxes altogether. Many low-income people actually saw their income tax drop by 100%. While we were in government. We were proud to reward their hard work. We wanted to ensure that work always paid more than welfare, so that people who made the decision to enter the workforce and earn some money would always be better off. That was the approach that our previous government took. And speaking of supply-side economics, they are the ones who believe in trickle-down government. This notion that if they tax enough from working families, from the poor, from the middle class, and then they take that money and give it to powerful and wealthy insiders like the billionaires who control Bombardier, like the so-called green energy entrepreneurs who've made hundreds of millions of dollars off of artificially inflated electricity contracts, that somehow that money is going to trickle down and help the poor. We know that doesn't work. It doesn't trickle down. It's people on the ground who work hard that lift us all up, and those are the people on whose side we are going to fight.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Rimouski, Nejet, Témiscouata, Les Basques. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Carleton for his speech. Obviously, there aren't many links to be made between the NDP and the Conservative economic plans, but I'm sure he agrees with me if we say that there's one thing that all parties agreed on in the election campaign was the reduction in taxes from 9 to 11% for small businesses. Now, when I talk to my constituents, and particularly to the small and medium-sized businesses in my riding, well, they expected, and they were planning for over the next 2 to 4 years, new investments to hire, to increase the salaries of their employees, and now they find that they can't do that. They're having to change their plans for growing their business and their future growth plans. So I'd like to hear my colleague talk about the effects of this in his riding, the small businesses in his riding, of how businesses are going to have to adjust given that the Liberals broke this promise. The honourable member for Carleton. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker. All the parties agreed that we should reduce taxes on our small and medium-sized businesses, and that's why we put it in our budget in 2015, and the Liberals, in their election platform, committed to respecting that tax reduction for our entrepreneurs. What's interesting is that for the next 5 years, the Liberals will take away $2 billion from our small businesses because of this broken promise. At the same time, as the two Liberal governments of Quebec and Canada will give that same $2 billion to Bombardier, a business controlled by billionaires. Mr. Speaker, we would prefer that money stays in the pockets of the entrepreneurs who have earned it instead of giving it to a business as a subvention, to a business that's very close with the Liberal government. So that's the different approach.
Of small business people who earned it rather than giving it to the billionaires who did not.
Reprise du débat.